And we'll now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Section 121 and the grave threat authority. Is it true that this requires a two-thirds vote? I think it's been said, but I'd just like to make sure that we agree. Let's talk about two-thirds, and who are we talking about when we say a two-thirds vote? Would you give the members of FSOC so that there can be some clarity as to whom it is will be casting these votes?
Certainly. First of all, you're right that it requires two-thirds vote in the affirmative by the FSOC. The FSOC voting members include the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Chairman of the FDIC, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Director of CFPB, the Director of the FHFA, the Chairman of the SEC, the Chairman of the CFTC, there is an independent insurance member, and there's one more that I've forgotten. Chairman of the NCUA.
And suffice it to say that we're talking about persons.
If the gentleman will yield for, and I'll give you the time. That's pretty amazing that he actually went through that. I think just we'll put that in the record.
I thought that
I'll
you
yield
would
you
have.
Back. We'll add.
Thank you. I thought he'd have a written list myself, to be quite candid with you. So my compliments to you as well. But the point is that the two-thirds vote comes from the heads of these various federal agencies. And this is done only after some deliberation, after reviewing empirical evidence. And this is an evolving system. You're right now in your infancy, and you are currently drafting and crafting these various rules, regulations, and standards. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct.
And is it true that as you go through this process, you do allow input from various other agencies or entities?
Yes, there are several non-voting members to the FSOC, including state banking and securities and insurance regulators.
And one can conclude that you don't do this arbitrarily and capriciously, that you're doing it in a systematic way so as to come to reasonable conclusions.
That's right.
Let's move now to the notion of divestiture. This was mentioned. There is a two-year window involved with the divestiture. Is this correct?
That's under Section 165, the Living Wills provision.
Yes. Explain that, please, so that we can understand that it just does not happen overnight.
Okay, so I'll take the question. The manner in which this proceeds is that there has to be a joint finding by the FDIC and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors that the living will is deficient, meaning that it does not provide for or facilitate an orderly resolution under the bankruptcy court, or as otherwise is not credible. Upon that finding of deficiency, the firm that is subject to that has an opportunity to correct the deficiency. And if it fails to do so, the first course of action is for the FDIC and the Federal Reserve to jointly impose higher capital liquidity requirements, restrict growth activities, operations. They're what we characterize as the customary supervisory enforcement actions that could be undertaken. If after the imposition of those actions, there is a failure still to remediate the problem associated with the firm's lack of resolvability, then the FDIC and the Federal Reserve Board, after consultation with the FSOC, may order divestiture of assets or operations of the firm.
And we're talking about institutions that have assets at above $50 billion, is that right?
Those are the only ones that are subject to this provision.
And a billion is still 1,000 million, is that correct?
Still is, yes.
Still 1,000 million. So we're talking about $50,000 million companies.
Yes.
And we can also note now that prior to Dodd-Frank, we didn't have a means of dealing with these 50, what did I say? 50,000
1,000
million. It seems like a rather large number, and it seems like we ought to have the ability to wind down a $50,000 million business that may pose a threat to the economic order. We call it a grave threat, but it just seems that we've provided that. And with this, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member.